The key fell from between the yellowed pages with a metallic clink that seemed to echo through 40 years of silence, and Margaret's hands began to tremble, not because of her arthritis, but because she recognized the number stamped into the brass. 447. The same number her father had whispered in his sleep during his final nights, when the morphine loosened memories he'd kept locked away since 1945. Wait. Before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Maggie? Harold's voice cut through the dusty air of the storage unit. What is it? She couldn't answer. The box of letters had tumbled when she'd pulled it from the stack, and now they lay scattered across the concrete floor like fallen soldiers, dozens of them, maybe 100, all addressed in the same careful script. The return address made her knees weak. CPL, James Fletcher, 101 Airborne Division. Her maiden name, her father's name. Jesus Christ, breathed, lowering himself carefully beside her. His bad hip protested, but he ignored it. In 53 years of marriage, he'd seen his wife cry exactly 4 times. This would be the 5th. Maggie, these are letters he never sent. Her voice was barely a whisper. Dad never sent them. The storage unit stretched behind them, 10 feet by 10 feet of forgotten history they'd won for $5 at the county auction. $5 because nobody else had bothered to bid. The auctioneer had seemed almost apologetic when he'd banged his gavel, as if embarrassed to have wasted everyone's time on Unit 447. There it was again, that number, which contained nothing but old boxes, a water-damaged dresser, and what appeared to be trash bags full of clothes. They'd come because their pension didn't quite cover the medications anymore, and Harold had read online about people finding treasures in abandoned storage units. Margaret had called it foolishness. Harold had called it hope. They'd compromised by agreeing to spend no more than $20. Now she held her father's words in her hands and the key to something neither of them understood. Harold picked up the nearest letter, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. The envelope was addressed to someone named Catherine Moreau in Normandy, France. The letter inside was written in English, but the address was annotated with what looked like French. It had never been stamped, never been mailed. "My dearest Catherine," he read aloud, "I am writing to you from a hospital in England, though they tell me I will be sent home soon. The doctors say I am healing well, but there are some wounds that go deeper than shrapnel. I need you to know that what happened in your father's barn was not your fault. You were only trying to save your family. I was the one who should have known better than to fall in love in the middle of a war." Margaret made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. Catherine. He never mentioned anyone named Catherine. "There's more." Harold's finger traced the lines. "I have something that belongs to your family, something your father entrusted to me before the Germans came. I have kept it safe, as I promised him I would, but I do not know how to return it to you. The war has made everything complicated. The lines we drew between right and wrong have been blurred by too much blood." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the debris of a life neither had known their father lived. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the rows of identical storage units, and somewhere in the distance, a truck rumbled past on the highway. Margaret's father had died when she was 16. That was 1968, 23 years after he came home from the war. It worked as a machinist at the Ford plant, drank too much on Saturdays, and went to Mass every Sunday. He'd been a quiet man, gentle with her mother, firm with his children. He'd never spoken about the war except to say he'd been lucky to come home. At his funeral, a handful of men from his old unit had shown up, gray-haired and somber, and they'd said the same thing. Jim Fletcher was one of the good ones. He'd saved lives. Nobody had mentioned France. Nobody had mentioned a woman named Catherine, and nobody had ever mentioned a key to a bank vault. Harold gathered more letters, organizing them by date. These go back to 1944, September, right after D-Day. He opened another. This one talks about a painting. Says it was hidden in the barn where he and this Catherine, where they hid from the SS. A painting? Margaret's head was spinning. Why would he have a painting? Says here it belonged to her father, a banker in Paris who moved his family to the countryside when the occupation started. Harold adjusted his glasses, squinting at the faded ink. My God, Maggie. He writes that the Germans were confiscating art from Jewish families. This Catherine's father wasn't Jewish, but he was hiding something for a client, a friend, someone who'd been taken. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture of a man Margaret didn't recognize. Her father, the machinist, had been involved in something to do with stolen art and French bankers and promises made in barns while the Nazis searched outside. She reached for the key again, turning it over in her palm. It was old-fashioned, solid brass, surprisingly heavy. The number 447 was stamped clearly on the bow, and beneath it, smaller, almost too faint to read, First National Trust, Detroit. Harold. Her voice was steady now, shifted into the practical tone she used when things got complicated. The bank, that's only 40 minutes from here. That was nearly 80 years ago, Maggie. But Harold was already pulling out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the small screen. Banks close, they get bought out, records get lost. Or they don't. She was standing now, the arthritis forgotten, 5 letters clutched in her hand. We have to find out. We have to know what he kept all these years. Harold looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the girl he'd fallen in love with in 1972. Fierce, determined, unwilling to let a mystery rest. It's past 3 o'clock. Banks close at 5. Then we'd better hurry. They left the storage unit open behind them, the letters carefully loaded into a cardboard box that Harold carried like it contained nitroglycerin. Margaret had the key in her pocket, her hand closed around it so the teeth bit into her palm. The drive to Detroit was 43 minutes of silence, punctuated by the occasional semi-truck roaring past. Margaret read letters while Harold drove their 20-year-old Buick down I-75. And with each page, her father became more of a stranger. He'd been 22 when he landed in France. A corporal with the 101st Airborne jumped into Normandy on D-Day with a rifle and a prayer. The early letters were typical soldier fare, missing home, hating the food, trying to sound brave for a mother who was probably sick with worry. But then, in late July, the tone changed. We liberated a town today called St. Côme. Small place, nothing special. But there was a girl. She gave us bread even though she had barely enough for herself. Her father was the town banker before the Germans came. Now he's just another Frenchman trying to survive. Her name is Catherine, and she has the saddest eyes I've ever seen. The next letter, a week later. I went back to St. Côme, told myself it was to check on the civilians, make sure the Germans hadn't returned. Catherine was in her father's garden, trying to grow vegetables in the bomb craters. We talked for hours. She speaks better English than half the guys in my unit. Says she learned from the BBC broadcasts before the war. Then in August. I'm in love with her. God help me, I'm in love with a French girl in the middle of a war, and I don't know if I'll survive long enough to do anything about it. Margaret's eyes blurred. This wasn't the father she'd known. This was a young man, barely older than a boy, falling in love in a nightmare. The letters told a story of stolen moments between battles. Catherine's father, Monsieur Moreau, had been entrusted with a painting by a Jewish banker named Abraham Rothstein before the man and his family were taken to Drancy, the transit camp outside Paris. The painting was valuable, a Monet, one of his water lily series. But more than that, it was all that remained of the Rothstein family's legacy. Moreau had promised to keep it safe until Abraham returned. But Abraham never returned. And when the SS came through St. Côme in late August, hunting for resistance fighters, Moreau had hidden the painting in his barn and told his daughter to flee into the countryside with the American soldier who'd been visiting too often. They'd hidden in that barn for 3 days while the Germans ransacked the town. And at some point during those 3 days, Moreau had made James Fletcher promise something. "If anything happens to me, you take the painting. You take it back to America. You keep it safe until Abraham's family can claim it. Don't let the Nazis have it. Don't let it disappear." The SS had found Moreau in his house. They'd shot him in his kitchen, execution style, for the crime of being a French banker who wouldn't tell them where the town's gold was hidden. There was no gold. There never had been. But they'd shot him anyway. Catherine and James had buried him in the garden where she'd grown her vegetables. Then, James had taken the painting, wrapped in oilcloth and canvas, and shipped it home in a crate marked agricultural equipment, along with a dozen other items looted by soldiers who didn't care about rules anymore. The painting had made it to Detroit, and James Fletcher, drowning in guilt and grief, had put it in a safety deposit box and never spoken of it again. "That's what the key opens," Margaret said, as Harold pulled into the parking lot of First National Trust, a granite building that looked like it had been there since before the war. "The box where he hid the painting." "Maggie!" Harold turned off the engine. "Even if the box still exists, we're not on the account. We can't just walk in there with a key and expect them to—" "Yes, we can." She was already out of the car, moving with a purpose he hadn't seen in years. "Because that painting doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the Rothstein family. And if there's even a chance they're still looking for it, we have to try." The bank lobby was all marble and brass, designed to inspire confidence in an era when banks were built like fortresses. A young woman at the reception desk looked up as they entered, her professional smile already in place. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" Margaret pulled out the key. "I need to access safety deposit box 447. The smile flickered. "Do you have the account information? The box holder's name?" "James Fletcher, my father. He opened this box sometime around 1945. The young woman's smile vanished entirely. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to get my manager." They waited on a leather bench that was probably original to the building while the receptionist disappeared into a back office. Harold took Margaret's hand, his thumb rubbing circles on her knuckles the way he always did when she was nervous. "This is crazy," he murmured. "We're chasing ghosts. We're chasing the truth." The manager who emerged was a black woman in her 50s named Patricia Morris, and her expression was unreadable as she studied the key Margaret held out. "Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore. Fletcher was my maiden name. And you believe your father opened this box in 1945. "I know he did. I found letters. And this key. It has your bank's name on it." Patricia Morris turned the key over in her hands, then looked at them both for a long moment. "Please, come with me." They followed her through a secured door, down a hallway lined with old photographs of Detroit in its glory days, and into a small conference room. Patricia closed the door. "Box 447 has been in our vault since 1946, she said without preamble. "The annual rental fee is $25. Someone has been paying it every year for 79 years. Margaret's breath caught. "Someone? Who?" "The payments come from an estate account managed by Rothstein & Associates, a law firm that closed in 1989. But the account still generates enough interest to cover the box fee. When Rothstein & Associates dissolved, the account was transferred to a trust overseen by their successor firm." She paused. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you have any idea what's in that box?" "A painting," Margaret said. "A Monet. It belonged to a Jewish family during the war." Patricia Morris sat down heavily. "Then you know." "Know what?" "That we've been trying to find the legal heir to that box for 30 years. The story Patricia told them was one of bureaucratic frustration and legal limbo. After Rothstein & Associates closed, the new firm had tried to locate James Fletcher to resolve the box's ownership. But by then, James had been dead for 20 years. They'd found his widow, Margaret's mother, but she'd known nothing about a box or a painting. She died in 1995 without ever learning what her husband had hidden. The law firm had then tried to find the Rothstein family, but the trail had gone cold. Abraham Rothstein and his wife had died in Auschwitz. They'd had one daughter, Sarah, who'd been 8 years old when she was taken. The Holocaust record suggested she'd survived the camp, but after that, nothing. She'd disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe like 10 million other displaced persons. Without an heir and without clear ownership, the box had remained locked. The trust paid its fees year after year, a memorial to people who might not exist anymore, guarding a painting that might have turned to dust decades ago. "But you have the key," Patricia said, "and you're James Fletcher's daughter. That gives us something we've never had before, a direct connection to the person who placed the item in the box." "What does that mean?" Harold asked. "It means I need to make some phone calls, and you two need to tell me everything you know." They stayed in that conference room until after the bank had closed to the public. Margaret recounted her father's story as best she could piece it together from the letters, while Patricia took notes and made periodic calls to lawyers who seemed to work very late hours. The story that emerged was both simpler and more complicated than Margaret had imagined. Her father had indeed smuggled the painting home in 1945. He'd put it in the safety deposit box and then contacted Rothstein and Associates, the law firm that had handled Abraham Rothstein's affairs before the war. He'd told them about the painting and about his promise to keep it safe for the family. The law firm had taken on the responsibility of trying to find Sarah Rothstein. They'd paid the box fee every year as a gesture of faith that someday she'd be found. But James Fletcher had made them promise something else, too. His name was never to be associated with the painting publicly. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want thanks. He wanted only to fulfill his promise to a dead man and a girl with sad eyes who'd lost her father in a barn. "Your father was protecting the Rothstein family," Patricia said gently. "If word got out that a Monet was sitting in a Detroit bank, every con artist and fortune hunter in the world would come out claiming to be the heir. He wanted to make sure that when Sarah was found, there would be no doubt, no competing claims, just a painting waiting for its rightful owner." "Did they ever find her?" Margaret asked. Patricia hesitated. "6 months ago, we got a letter from an attorney in Paris. He represents a woman named Sarah Rothstein Beaumont. She's 88 years old. She lives in Lyon, and she's been looking for that painting for 70 years. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. "She knows?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "She knows about the painting?" Her father told her about it before they were taken. It was the last thing he said to her. "Remember the water lilies." She thought it meant the painting had been destroyed. All these years, she thought it was gone. But 3 years ago, she hired a genealogist to trace her family's stolen property. And they found a reference in old Rothstein and Associates files, a note about a painting placed in trust by an American soldier. "Is she—" Margaret couldn't finish the question. "She's dying," Patricia said quietly. "Stage 4 cancer. The attorney's letter said she has maybe a year. She wants to see the painting before she dies. She wants to know that her father's last wish was honored." Harold made a sound low in his throat. Margaret realized she was crying, tears running down her face in hot tracks. "We need to open the box," she said. "Now, tonight." "I can't," Patricia said. "Even with the key, we need legal authorization. But I can make it happen quickly. Give me 3 days." 3 days might be too long. "It's the best I can do." They drove home in darkness, neither speaking until they were pulling into their driveway. The house was a small ranch they'd bought in 1976. Nothing special, but it was theirs. Harold turned off the engine, but didn't get out. "Your father was a good man," he said finally. "I never knew him." Margaret's voice was raw. "I lived with him for 16 years, and I never knew him at all." "That's not true. You knew the man he became after the war. This, Harold gestured at the box of letters in the back seat, this is the man he was during the war. They're not the same person. But why didn't he tell me? Why did he keep it all secret? Harold was quiet for a long time. Maybe because some promises are too heavy to share. Maybe he thought if he told you about Catherine and Monsieur Moreau and the painting, he'd have to tell you about all the other things he did in the war, the things he saw, the things that haunted him. He turned to look at her. You said he drank too much on Saturdays. You said he had nightmares. Maybe the painting was the only good thing that came out of France, and he couldn't bear to talk about it because it would mean remembering everything else. Margaret leaned her head against the cool window. He loved her, Catherine, the way he wrote about her. And then he came home and married your mother. Do you think he loved Mom? I think he loved her differently. Harold reached for her hand again. War changes people, Maggie. It makes them into different versions of themselves. The boy who loved Catherine died in France, even if his body came home. The man who loved your mother was someone new, someone trying to be better than what the war had made him. They sat in the car for another 10 minutes, not talking, just being together in the darkness. Finally, Margaret stirred. I need to read the rest of the letters, she said, all of them. I need to know the whole story. They carried the box inside and spread the letters across the dining room table, organizing them by date. There were 114 in total, spanning from June 1944 to March 1946. None of them had ever been mailed. Margaret read through the night while Harold dozed in his recliner. The story the letters told was one of love and loss, of impossible promises and the weight of surviving when so many others didn't. James Fletcher had loved Catherine Moreau with the desperate intensity of a young man who knew he might die tomorrow. Their relationship had been a bright spot in the darkness of war, a few stolen hours of normalcy amid the chaos. But when her father died and James took the painting, something broke between them. Catherine blamed herself for her father's death. If she hadn't fallen in love with an American soldier, if she hadn't brought him to their house, the SS might never have noticed them. She withdrew into her grief, and James, traumatized by combat and drowning in survivor's guilt, didn't know how to reach her. The last letter he'd written to her was dated January 1946, 6 months after he'd returned home. My dearest Catherine, I am writing to tell you that I am getting married. Her name is Dorothy, and she is kind and steady and nothing like you. She does not make my heart race or my hands shake. She does not make me feel like I am standing on the edge of a cliff. She makes me feel safe, and after everything we have been through, safe is what I need. I hope you understand. I hope you have found safety too. I have kept my promise to your father. The painting is secure. Someday, when Abraham's daughter is found, it will be returned to her. This is the only good thing I brought home from France. I want you to know that. I want you to know that your father's death meant something. I am sorry I could not save him. I am sorry I could not save you from your sadness. I am sorry I was not strong enough to be what you needed. Be well, Catherine. Be happy if you can. You deserve more happiness than this world has given you. Margaret set the letter down with shaking hands. Her mother's name had been Dorothy. Dorothy Fletcher, who'd worked as a nurse at the VA hospital where James was treated for his wounds, who'd been patient and understanding when he woke up screaming, who'd never asked him questions about the war because she sensed he couldn't answer them. Her parents' marriage had been built on silence and survival. It had been good enough. It had been what they both needed, but it had never been the grand passion her father had known in France. The thought made Margaret inexplicably sad. Not because her father hadn't loved her mother, she knew he had, in his way, but because he'd lived 50 years carrying a love he couldn't talk about and a promise he couldn't break, and it must have been so lonely. Harold woke up around 3 in the morning and found her crying at the table, surrounded by letters. Maggie? "He was just a kid," she sobbed. "He was 22 years old, and they sent him to war, and he saw his friends die, and he fell in love, and he watched her father get murdered, and then he came home and had to pretend to be normal. He was just a kid, Harold." Harold held her while she cried for the father she'd never really known, and the boy he'd been before the war made him into someone else. The 3 days passed slowly. Patricia Morris called daily with updates. The lawyers were reviewing the case, the trust was being notified. Sarah Rothstein Beaumont's attorney in Paris was preparing documentation. Everything was proceeding as quickly as possible, but bureaucracy was bureaucracy, even when someone was dying. Margaret spent the time researching. She found old census records and military documents. She found her father's discharge papers and his Purple Heart citation, wounded in action near Bastogne, December 1944. She'd known about the Purple Heart. It had been in a drawer in his dresser, and after he died, her mother had put it in a box with his other things. Margaret had packed that box when her mother died and stored it in her attic without ever looking inside. Now she pulled it down and went through it piece by piece. The Purple Heart, his dog tags, a photograph of him in uniform, impossibly young, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a dried flower. Lavender, preserved for 80 years, brittle and faded, but still fragrant if you held it close enough. She knew without being told that Catherine had given it to him. Harold found her in the attic, holding the lavender and crying again. "We've cried more in the last 3 days than in the last 3 years, he said, but his voice was gentle. "I don't know how to process this," Margaret admitted. "My whole life, I thought I knew who my father was. Now I find out he was this completely different person. He had this whole other life before I existed, and it shaped everything about him, but he never told me." "Maybe that's what being a parent is," Harold said. "You have all these experiences and memories and pieces of yourself that existed before your children were born, but you don't share them because you want to be just dad or mom, not a complicated person with a complicated past. Did you do that? Keep things from your kids?" Harold smiled sadly. "I never told them about the year I spent homeless before I met you, or about the brother I lost when I was 15, or about 100 other things that hurt too much to remember. I wanted to be their father, not a wounded person they had to worry about." Margaret leaned against him. "We're all just wounded people pretending to be whole." "Yeah," Harold agreed, "but sometimes the pretending is what keeps us alive." On the morning of the 4th day, Patricia Morris called. "We can open the box today. 2 o'clock. Can you be here?" They were there at 1:30, dressed in their best clothes like they were going to church. Patricia met them in the lobby with a small entourage. 2 lawyers, a notary, and an art specialist from the Detroit Institute of Arts who looked like he'd been roused from retirement specifically for this occasion. "Before we go down to the vault," Patricia said, "I need you to understand something. We don't know what condition the painting is in. It's been sealed in that box for almost 80 years. Climate-controlled, yes, but still. It might have deteriorated. It might not be salvageable." "Sarah Rothstein Beaumont needs to know either way," Margaret said firmly. "Even if it's ruined, she deserves to know that someone tried to save it." Patricia nodded. "Then let's find out." The vault was in the basement, behind a door that looked like it belonged in a museum. Patricia used her key and Margaret used the brass key numbered 447, and together they turned them in the lock. The safety deposit box was larger than Margaret had expected, 2 feet by 3 feet, and surprisingly heavy when the bank attendant pulled it from its slot in the wall. They carried it to a private viewing room where the art specialist had set up lights and a camera. "For documentation," he explained. "Whatever we find, we need to record it." Margaret's hands were shaking so badly that Harold had to help her lift the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and canvas, protected by desiccant packets that had long since exhausted their moisture-absorbing capability, was a wooden frame. The art specialist took over, his hands steady and sure as he carefully unwrapped the layers. No one spoke. The only sound was the rustle of ancient cloth and the whir of the camera. And then the painting emerged. Water lilies. A riot of blues and greens and purples, the light dancing on water, the impression of a world that existed in a single perfect moment before violence and hatred tore it apart. It was smaller than Margaret had imagined, perhaps 2 feet square, but it filled the room with its quiet beauty. The art specialist was crying, actual tears running down his weathered face. "It's real," he whispered. "My God, it's real, and it's in perfect condition." Patricia Morris was making phone calls, her voice shaking as she spoke rapid-fire French to someone in Paris. The lawyers were taking photographs and making notes. Harold was holding Margaret's hand so tightly she thought her fingers might break. But Margaret was looking at the painting, at the water lilies her father had carried home from a war, and she was thinking about a promise made in a barn while Nazis hunted outside. She was thinking about a young man who'd loved a sad-eyed girl, and an old man who'd trusted an American soldier with his most precious possession. She was thinking about the weight of that promise, carried in silence for 50 years, never broken, never forgotten. "Your father was a hero," Patricia said quietly, appearing at her shoulder. "Not because he fought in the war, because he kept his word when it would have been so easy to forget. He could have sold this painting at any time. It's worth millions. But he didn't. He kept his promise." "When does Sarah get it?" Margaret asked. "The Paris attorney is making arrangements now. Given her health, we'll expedite everything. The painting will be on a plane to France within the week." Patricia paused. "She wants to meet you, Sarah Rothstein Beaumont. She wants to meet James Fletcher's daughter and thank her in person." "She shouldn't be thanking me. I didn't do anything." "You found the painting. You brought it home. That's everything." Margaret looked at Harold, a question in her eyes. They were on a fixed income. The trip to France would cost money they didn't really have. But Harold was already nodding. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We have to go." 2 weeks later, they stood in the garden of a small house in Lyon, France, breathing air that smelled of lavender and roses. Sarah Rothstein Beaumont was smaller than Margaret had imagined, bird-boned and fragile, her face a map of 98 years of living. But her eyes were sharp and clear, and when she took Margaret's hands in hers, her grip was surprisingly strong. "You look like him," she said in accented English. "You have your father's eyes." They sat in the garden while Sarah's granddaughter brought tea and small cakes that no one ate. The Monet hung on the wall inside the house, visible through the open French doors, returned at last to the family it had been stolen from. "I need to tell you about your father," Sarah said, "because I knew him, you see, after the war." Margaret's breath caught. "You knew him?" "Catherine Moreau was my cousin. My mother and her mother were sisters. When I came back from the camps, I had nothing and no one. My parents were dead, my grandparents were dead. I was 13 years old and alone in the world. Catherine found me in a displaced persons camp in Germany and brought me to France. She raised me as her own daughter." The world tilted again. Margaret gripped Harold's hand. "Catherine told me about your father, about the American soldier who'd loved her and taken the painting to keep it safe. She told me about the promise he'd made to my grandfather in the barn. And she told me that even though her heart was broken, even though the war had taken everything from her, she was grateful he'd survived. She was grateful someone had kept the promise." "Did she—" Margaret couldn't finish the question, but Sarah understood. "Did she love him?" "Yes, very much, for the rest of her life. She never married. She said she'd already had her great love, and once was enough for any lifetime." Sarah smiled, sad and sweet, but she was glad he found happiness, glad he married and had a family. She didn't want him to be alone with his ghosts the way she was. "You had," Margaret said. "Yes, she had me, And I like to think I gave her a reason to keep living when she wanted very much to die. Sarah patted Margaret's hand. Your father saved my family's legacy, but more than that, he saved Catherine. She told me once that knowing he'd kept his promise, that he'd taken the painting and protected it, was the only thing that made her father's death bearable. It meant he died for something, for someone's future. They talked for hours, piecing together the story from two sides. Sarah told them about Catherine, who'd worked as a teacher after the war and died in 1992, still carrying a dried sprig of American wildflower in her prayer book. Margaret told Sarah about James, who'd worked in a factory and raised 3 children and woken up screaming from nightmares he never explained. 2 ordinary people who'd loved each other in extraordinary circumstances and then lived the rest of their lives apart, connected only by a promise and a painting and memories they couldn't share with anyone else. As the sun set over Lyon, Sarah took Margaret into the house and showed her the Monet up close. The water lilies seemed to glow in the evening light, alive with all the colors of hope. "What will you do with it?" Margaret asked. "Will you keep it?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm donating it to the Holocaust Museum in Paris. I want it to be there for people to see, to remember. I want them to know that even in the darkest times, there are people who keep their promises. People like your father and my grandfather and Catherine, who all chose to be brave when it would have been easier to give up." She turned to Margaret. "But I want you to have something." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a photograph Margaret recognized. Her father, young and in uniform, standing next to a beautiful dark-haired woman in front of a half-destroyed barn. "Catherine kept this," Sarah said. "She wanted you to have it. She left a letter years ago in case you were ever found. Would you like to read it?" Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded the thin paper. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the English formal in the way of someone who'd learned it from books. "Dear daughter of James Fletcher, if you are reading this, it means you have learned the truth about your father and me. I hope this knowledge does not cause you pain. I want you to know that your father was the best man I ever knew. He was brave and kind and honest, and he loved me in a way I will treasure until my last breath. But more importantly, he loved you." Catherine wrote that James had told her about his children in one of his last letters, how they were the reason he got up each morning, how they made all the suffering worthwhile. He made the right choice in choosing a simple, peaceful life. He earned that peace. Please do not judge him for keeping secrets. We all kept secrets after the war. They were the only way we could survive. Know that he was loved and that he loved well. That is enough for any life. Yours in gratitude and friendship, Catherine Moreau. Margaret folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box with the photograph. She couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight. Harold put his arm around her as they stood in front of the Monet, and Sarah stood on her other side, and the 3 of them looked at the water lilies together. 3 people connected by war and love and promises kept across generations. "Thank you," Margaret finally managed, "for telling me about him, for letting me know who he really was." "Thank you for bringing the painting home," Sarah replied, "and for making the journey here. I know it wasn't easy." "It was necessary," Margaret said simply. They stayed in France for 5 more days, walking the streets of Lyon, visiting the museum where the Monet would eventually hang, and spending hours with Sarah, who seemed to grow stronger with each day, as if having the painting returned had given her permission to let go. On their last evening, Sarah took them to a small restaurant near her house. Over wine and cheese, she told them stories about Catherine, how she'd grown flowers in bomb craters, how she'd taught Sarah to read French and English and German, how she'd insisted on beauty even when the world seemed determined to destroy it. "She told me once," Sarah said, her voice growing soft, That during those 3 days in the barn with your father, while they waited for the SS to leave, they talked about the kind of world they wanted to build after the war. A world where art was protected, where families stayed together, where love was possible even in darkness. She said your father promised her that if he survived, he would try to make that world real. And did he? Margaret asked. Sarah smiled. He kept his promise about the painting. That's making the world better. He raised you, and you came here to find me. That's making the world better. He raised her glass. To James Fletcher, who kept his promises. To James Fletcher, they echoed. On the plane home, Margaret sat with the wooden box in her lap, the photograph and Catherine's letter inside. Harold dozed beside her, his head on her shoulder, and she thought about her father, both versions of him. The young soldier who'd fallen in love in France, and the quiet machinist who'd worked hard and provided for his family, and never spoken about the war. Both men had been her father. Both men had been real. And now, finally, she understood that carrying secrets didn't make you dishonest. Sometimes it made you strong. Sometimes it was the only way to survive. When they got home, Margaret framed the photograph of her father and Catherine and hung it in the hallway next to the picture of her parents on their wedding day. 2 moments, 2 loves, 2 versions of the same man, both true, both honored. The storage unit stayed rented for another month while they sorted through the rest of its contents. Most of it was unremarkable, old clothes, some dishes, a few books. But at the bottom of the last box, wrapped in newspaper from 1968, Margaret found one more letter. This one was addressed to her. My dear Margaret, if you're reading this, it means you found a painting and learned about Catherine. I don't know when that will be. Maybe you'll find this tomorrow, or maybe 50 years from now, or maybe never. But I need to write these words in case there's ever a chance you'll read them. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about France while I was alive. I'm sorry I couldn't explain why I woke up screaming, or why I drank too much, or why I sometimes looked at your mother with sadness in my eyes. The war broke something in me, and I spent the rest of my life trying to glue the pieces back together. I did my best. I hope it was enough. I want you to know that I loved your mother very much. Not the way I loved Catherine. That was young love, war love, desperate love. But I loved your mother with my whole heart, and I never regretted choosing her. She saved me. You saved me. Your brothers and sisters saved me. You gave me a reason to be more than what the war made me. The painting was my burden to carry, and I carried it gladly because it was the only good thing I brought home from France. Knowing it was safe, knowing that someday it might be returned to Abraham Rothstein's family, made all the darkness worth it. If you found it, if you've returned it, then thank you. Thank you for finishing what I started. Thank you for being the daughter I was too broken to deserve. I hope you can forgive me for keeping secrets. I hope you can understand that some things are too heavy to share. Live well, Margaret. Be happy. Don't carry anyone else's ghosts but your own. All my love, Dad. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it with the others. Harold found her sitting on the floor of the empty storage unit, crying one last time. Good tears or bad tears? He asked. Both, she said. All of them. Every kind of tear there is. He sat beside her on the dusty concrete. $5, he said after a while. We paid $5 for this unit. Best investment we ever made. Better than our 401k? So much better. They laughed, and then they cried, and then they laughed again, and finally Harold pulled her to her feet. Come on, he said, let's go home. They locked the storage unit for the last time and drove back to their small ranch house with its garden and its memories and its photographs of a man who'd kept his promises. That evening, Margaret made dinner while Harold worked in the garage, and everything was ordinary and normal and exactly as it should be. But on the mantelpiece, next to the photographs, Margaret placed the brass key numbered 447. Not hidden away, not forgotten, just there, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that promises kept in barns during wartime can echo across generations. 3 months later, they received a letter from France. Sarah Rothstein Beaumont had died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family with the Monet hanging where she could see it. Her granddaughter wrote that Sarah's last words had been about Catherine and James and water lilies that had survived the darkness. Margaret cried when she read the letter, but they were good tears, clean tears, the kind that wash things away instead of drowning you. She wrote back to Sarah's granddaughter, telling her about the photograph and Catherine's letter and all the stories they'd shared. They began corresponding regularly, these two women connected by war and art and the promises their grandparents had made. And sometimes, late at night, Margaret would take out her father's letters and read them again, hearing his voice in the words, seeing him as the young man he'd been before the world broke him. She understood now that everyone carries ghosts, everyone has secrets, everyone is trying their best to be whole when they're really just pieces glued together with hope and stubbornness. Her father had been brave, not because he'd fought in a war, but because he'd kept fighting long after the war ended, because he'd protected a painting and a promise and a love he couldn't talk about, and he'd built a life anyway. He'd been a good father. He'd been a good husband. He'd been a good man, even when being good cost him everything. The storage unit auction had cost $5, but what they'd found inside was priceless. Not because of the Monet, though that was worth millions, but because it had given Margaret her father back, the real him, all of him, the broken parts and the brave parts, and the parts that loved so deeply he had to keep it secret to survive. Harold found her one evening sitting in front of the photograph of young James and Catherine, the brass key in her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking that we tell our kids tomorrow," she said, "about their grandfather, about France and Catherine and the painting, about promises and ghosts and being brave enough to keep living." "They should know," Harold agreed. "Everyone should know," Margaret said, "that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that love survives wars, that promises matter, even when keeping them hurt." She placed the key back on the mantelpiece, next to the photograph, where the light from the window made the brass glow like gold. Outside, the world went on. Cars driving past, neighbors mowing lawns, children playing in yards. Ordinary life, unremarkable and beautiful. The kind of life her father had fought for, had survived for, had built with his scarred hands and broken heart. The kind of life worth living, the kind of life worth remembering. And in a museum in Paris, water lilies bloomed on canvas, eternal and lovely, waiting for visitors who would see them and know, truly know, that even in the darkest times, even when everything seems lost, there are still people who keep their promises. There are still people who choose love. There are still people like James Fletcher, who carried ghosts and secrets and impossible burdens, and built something beautiful anyway. Margaret turned off the lights and went to bed, Harold's warm presence beside her, and for the first time since finding those letters, she slept without crying. In the morning, she would call her children. She would tell them about their grandfather. She would pass on the story and the photograph and the key, and the next generation would know what this one had sacrificed. But tonight, she simply slept, dreamless and peaceful, while the brass key on the mantelpiece caught the moonlight and gleamed in the darkness, like a promise kept, like a love remembered, like all the best things humans do when they're brave enough to try. So much better. They laughed, and then they cried, and then they laughed again, and finally Harold pulled her to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." They locked the storage unit for the last time and drove back to their small ranch house with its garden and its memories and its photographs of a man who'd kept his promises. That evening, Margaret made dinner while Harold worked in the garage, and everything was ordinary and normal and exactly as it should be. But on the mantelpiece, next to the photographs, Margaret placed the brass key, numbered 447, not hidden away, not forgotten. Just there, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that promises kept in barns during wartime can echo across generations. 3 months later, they received a letter from France. Sarah Rothstein Beaumont had died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, with the Monet hanging where she could see it. Her granddaughter wrote that Sarah's last words had been about Catherine and James and water lilies that had survived the darkness. Margaret cried when she read the letter, but they were good tears, clean tears, the kind that wash things away instead of drowning you. She wrote back to Sarah's granddaughter, telling her about the photograph in Catherine's letter and all the stories they'd shared. They began corresponding regularly, these two women connected by war and art and the promises their grandparents had made. And sometimes, late at night, Margaret would take out her father's letters and read them again, hearing his voice in the words, seeing him as the young man he'd been before the world broke him. She understood now that everyone carries ghosts, everyone has secrets, everyone is trying their best to be whole when they're really just pieces glued together with hope and stubbornness. Her father had been brave, not because he'd fought in a war, but because he'd kept fighting long after the war ended. Because he'd protected a painting and a promise and a love he couldn't talk about, and he'd built a life anyway. He'd been a good father. He'd been a good husband. He'd been a good man, even when being good cost him everything. The storage unit auction had cost $5, but what they'd found inside was priceless, not because of the Monet, though that was worth millions, but because it had given Margaret her father back, the real him, all of him. The broken parts and the brave parts and the parts that loved so deeply he had to keep it secret to survive. Harold found her one evening sitting in front of the photograph of young James and Catherine, the brass key in her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking that we tell our kids tomorrow," she said, "about their grandfather, about France and Catherine and the painting, about promises and ghosts and being brave enough to keep living." "They should know," Harold agreed. "Everyone should know," Margaret said, "that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that love survives wars, that promises matter, even when keeping them hurt." She placed the key back on the mantelpiece next to the photograph, where the light from the window made the brass glow like gold. Outside, the world went on. Cars driving past, neighbors mowing lawns, children playing in yards. Ordinary life, unremarkable and beautiful. The kind of life her father had fought for, had survived for, had built with his scarred hands and broken heart. The kind of life worth living. The kind of life worth remembering. And in a museum in Paris, water lilies bloomed on canvas, eternal and lovely, waiting for visitors who would see them and know, truly know, that even in the darkest times, even when everything seems lost, there are still people who keep their promises. There are still people who choose love. There are still people like James Fletcher, who carried ghosts and secrets and impossible burdens, and built something beautiful anyway. Margaret turned off the lights and went to bed, Harold's warm presence beside her, and for the first time since finding those letters, she slept without crying. In the morning, she would call her children. She would tell them about their grandfather. She would pass on the story and the photograph and the key, and the next generation would know what this one had sacrificed. But tonight, she simply slept, dreamless and peaceful, while the brass key on the mantelpiece caught the moonlight and gleamed in the darkness like a promise kept, like a love remembered, like all the best things humans do when they're brave enough to try.